So this is the 2023 Maruti Suzuki Fronx. This has a booster jet engine. The booster jet is back, and this is one of the only turbo petrol cars sold in India.
And this is the OG Baleno RS, the first turbo petrol car ever introduced from Maruti. So, what's the point of having both these cars together? This one's a hatchback, this one's a hatchback, but we all know Maruti tries to sell it as an SUV. But inside, where it really matters, they're both the same. They both have the same chassis, they both front-wheel drive, have a 5-speed manual gearbox, 3-cylinder engines with a bit of turbo helping. But can the Fronx actually match the Baleno RS, the original Maruti Suzuki hot hatch? Or will it fall short? Or maybe even exceed our expectations? Let's find out. So, we're in the Baleno RS, and as you can hear, it's not stock. This car has an HKS end can in it, and it has no catalytic converters. So it's straight piped, which should help it make a little bit more power, but it's pretty much the same, pretty similar to stock. So what's the initial feeling you get when you drive this car? The gearbox, typical Maruti gearbox, slick shifting, nice. The steering is dead. You get no feedback from the steering. It's not that light, it's quite okay. The engine, on the other hand, feels pretty lethargic. It doesn't pull unless you downshift. It doesn't feel like most modern turbo petrol engines. And it's only after 2,500 or 3,000 RPM where you actually feel like you're making some progress. And the steering doesn't quite return to center as well unless you accelerate. So, what's the big difference between this and a normal Baleno? Well, yeah, there's the turbo petrol engine, but Maruti made a few different tweaks to that as well, to the rest of the car. It had slightly stiffer springs. The shock absorbers were pretty much the same, but the springs were slightly stiffer, and you can feel it when you drive the car. It feels much more composed than a normal Baleno or a Swift or even the Fronx. When you corner in this car, it feels like it's gripping the road. The tail does come out if you do some stupid shit on the road, but that's part of the hot hatch experience. This car weighs 950 kgs, which is nothing, and it has discs on all 4 tires. That's a big thing. Having a car this light with that much stopping power, and you can feel it. It's so sure-footed when you're braking. This car has slightly bigger tires than the normal one. It has Bridgestone Turanzas on 205s, and it's run about 30 grand on those tires. But it still stops so well, and that's something I think the Fronx should have had, because it makes such a big difference. I love the way it looks. The Baleno always was a very nice looking car, but the thing is with Marutis, you see so much of them on the road that they stop feeling special. Well, this does look special because Baleno RS, well, it didn't quite sell. The engine in the Baleno RS was actually not localized. All the parts and all came from Japan. That's not the case for the Fronx. The engine in that is localized and the turbocharger is different. The big difference between this turbo petrol car and the others you get these days is the intercooler. We have really hot summers in India, and if you wish to drive these cars in some sort of competition, an autocross, or make a race car out of it, or a rally car, and if it's some sort of stock category, or even just driving on the road, this car doesn't thermal throttle. It will maintain the amount of power it makes because it has a good cooling system, and that's what Maruti always takes care of. Mileage wise, you don't get much. You'll hover around 11 to 14 depending on where you're driving. The worst you can get is about 6 or 7 if you're driving like me. But the car feels good. You feel special when you drive it. There's just something about it. Having a good light Japanese car with an engine with some torque. The engine is where it, I think, slightly falls short, because even though it has a turbocharger and it's JDM, but it just feels lethargic when you're not pushing it or like driving it in a normal manner, which just wants to make you push it more, and then you get no mileage. But it is a fun car. The way it corners, the way it grips the road is something like, I think it's even better than a Polo TSI in the way it corners, because it has a wider track than the Polo TSI and much better brakes. And stiffness wise, I can't quite remember how the Polo TSI felt. I have driven it, but it was a few months ago. If you compare the 0 to 100 times of both these cars, the Fronx is actually slightly quicker, and that's, I think, down to the turbo tuning of the Fronx. This car pulls till 6000 rpm. That could be because of the straight piping, the lack of emission systems in the car, but it is more of a driver's car. The way you get to 100 in this car is slightly more enthusiastic, because the car pulls all the way to 6 grand. And in the Fronx, after 5 to 6 in that car is pretty, the turbos had it by then, and you're just revving the car and the power is pretty much the same. Both the cars have fuel cutoff at 6000 rpm, so they don't rev a lot, but that's how much you can't expect more from a small turbo petrol engine. It doesn't have the sense of urgency that the K12 has, but the K12 doesn't have this sort of torque either. You can drive this car quite swiftly without having to, roll through the gears as much. But you still have to roll through gears, because it's not like as good as a Polo TSI or a Hyundai turbo car. It doesn't have that sort of refinement. But it is a very fun car to drive, and it makes a lot of noise. This is the perfect car for a boy racer.
Okay, so now we're in the Fronx, and the interior is a lot more plush. It is a much nicer place to be in than the Baleno RS. There's leather everywhere. The steering wheel looks very good, and it's softer than the Baleno RS. It feels more luxurious, more like a family car, more like an SUV. The steering feel, it's pretty dead. It's not great at all. You don't feel anything while cornering. And at high speeds, they've tried to build in some sort of software that makes you think that you have some feel, but it's all fake. It does not feel real at all. It's bizarre, if anything. So, how do you feel after driving the Baleno RS and the Fronx?
It's a much nicer place to be in. There's some fake leather here, fake leather there. They've tried to make this look a lot more plush. But I don't like this matte finish. I'll start nitpicking about the car. This is not nice. You get a bigger screen on the top model, but this is the Zeta model, and you miss out on a few functions like a heads-up display, and this just doesn't look aesthetic to me. The air controls, climate control vents are pretty nice, like aircraft toggle switches. The engine feels much more quieter. That's because this car doesn't have an exhaust. But other than that, the car has much more softer of a suspension, and you can instantly feel that it has a drum in the back. It has a bit more pitch and roll sideways, and when you're braking there's a bit more nose dive, but it's a much more smoother driving experience. They've tried to make it an SUV, even though it's not an SUV. It's still better over bumps. This car has 17-inch alloys, and even with that it feels pretty nice over bumps. It doesn't feel bad. You get a few more screens in the MID, that's nice, but there's nothing much. And apart from that, there are a few faults in the car. First of all, behind the steering wheel you can feel like the plastic finish is not nice. It like gets scratched by it. It's not a nice feeling. And then in the back you have to keep all the seat belts buckled in, even if there's no one sitting behind, because even though it has a rear seat belt alarm, it does not have any sort of weight sensor in it. So that's like a place where they started to cut costs. Another thing is the indicator. It's very loud and it doesn't sound nice at all. Neither does the horn, but that's okay. You get a wireless charging pad. It's the ease of living, or like quality of life in this car is much better, much nicer. And it's got this smart hybrid system, so like if you're like really in the low range, you can actually feel it. I can feel like there's some sort of electrical assistance in the driving experience. The car doesn't rev all the way to 6 as well as the Baleno does, but it is faster than the Baleno RS, and that's just down to the turbo tuning. There's more, the spread of power is wider, but it does not pull all the way to 6. It'll stop pulling after 5, and 5 to 6 is like the same thing. And that's where I think the car like is slightly quicker than the Baleno RS. So, what have we learned? The Baleno RS had a few touches to make it more special. The body kit, the disc at the back, the slightly stiffer springs. It made you feel a bit more special, like you went that extra mile and bought the RS. The Fronx, on the other hand, looks the same, but it does look quite good, in my opinion. But mechanically, they haven't really done anything special to it to make it that bit more special when you're driving it. It's got a drum in the back, the suspension is soft and it's jacked up. Drivability, on the other hand, is better with the Fronx, but sportiness is where you like to go with the Baleno RS. And that's the payoff you get. This car is more drivable, it's more comfortable, but the Baleno RS, well, it's a cult classic.